I'm going to turn your attention to Genesis chapter 11 today, and pardon me in advance. I have a bit of a scratchy throat issue here that's causing me problems. Hopefully, we'll be able to tough it out. Before we get into that, I would like to turn your attention to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13, which is in contention, at the very least, for verse most quoted out of context in the Bible. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. There are a lot of people who will attach that to any claim they may have, any kind of agenda, any kind of dream, any kind of mission statement they may have in this life. That they are setting their mind to. Maybe it's a marriage thing, maybe it's a money thing, maybe it's an education thing, whatever it happens to be. I am setting my head to this task here in my mind, my efforts, my body into this task, and I'm going to succeed because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And we ignore oftentimes the underlying premises behind that statement. It may not be stated in so many words, but it is necessarily implied in that. Because if it is Christ who is strengthening me in these things, then it must necessarily be the case that these things, whatever they are in, at the very least, in harmony with God's word. And I would argue that they are a manifestation of God's word, a manifestation, for God's plan in our life. Jesus is not empowering us to do something sinful. I want to rob every bank in America, and I know I'm going to succeed because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Well, we realize that's ridiculous. He's not going to empower us to do something sinful. But in the big picture, it's not so much a matter of whether the individual activity is sinful or not sinful. It's a matter of who are you letting direct your life. Whatever your specific agenda happens to be, if it is not serving God first and foremost, if it is not pursuing God's will in your life, then you are being rebellious and self-willed, and anything that you do, any kind of task that you're putting your hand to, is opposed to God's plan when it doesn't include and feature, and in fact, emphasize, make primary God's plan for your life. God is the one who has to be driving the boat for us here in all of these things. That's what Jesus is going to empower us to do. There are all kinds of things that we set our mind to that are not necessarily in harmony with God's will. In fact, very well may be opposed to God's will. Such is the case in Genesis chapter 11, at least to a certain degree. I think it's fair to say that the people in this Babel experience here in Genesis 11 are trying to subvert the will of God in the lives of human beings, in their own lives and the lives of others as well. I think that is implied in the text. We see back in Genesis chapter 1 that God's plan was always for human beings to fill the earth and subdue it. We get the similar expression in Genesis chapter 9 when Noah and his family get off the ark. The plan is for the earth to be populated at large. That was the plan back then anyway. I think that we're doing a fairly decent job of that these days, but that's a side issue. Back in these days, the world was not populated, not by any stretch of the imagination. There were certain areas that seemed to be more inclined toward population than others, and one of these areas is called today Mesopotamia. Today it's in the modern-day nation of Iraq, in the region of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This region became a population center very early on. We see vague references to it in the book of Genesis. We see it later on with the nation of Babylon and the nation of Assyria, etc. This is where a lot of people came to live. We see that starting in the days of Nimrod in Genesis chapter 11. I've done an entire Nimrod sermon here about the tower and the rationalizations for the tower, etc. In previous sermon. You can go back and search for that if you want to. I don't want to go down that road here today. I want to talk about why it is that God threw a wrench in the works here. Why did God want to cause this plan to fail? And why he, by extension, causes our plans to fail. If we get lucky, he causes them to fail. If we are set opposed to God's things, if we are going in some otherwise direction, it very well may be that God interferes with this somehow providentially and nudges us in another direction. And we wake up 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, realizing that God saved us from ourselves. At least we want to attach God to that. It seems like it's far better off for us that we went in the so-called wrong direction way back when. We wanted to go this way. We wound up going this other way instead, and look how wonderful it turned out. God knows better than we do, as it happens. That's always the case. Sometimes we can kind of see his fingerprints, or we think we can see. Anyways, fingerprints in all of this. Certainly, if we are engaged in some kind of sinful behavior, rebellious behavior, we call out to God to interfere with that. Sometimes we might pray that he defeat us in the things that are contrary to his will. Now, that's not going to fix things, of course. If we're rebellious, we're probably going to continue to be rebellious, unfortunately. But maybe we can learn a lesson. Maybe some of the people here at Babel learned a lesson because God intervened and kept them from doing the thing that they thought they wanted to do. Let's read the story here in Genesis chapter 11, starting in verse number 1. The whole earth had the same language and vocabulary. As people migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make oven-fired bricks." They used brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves, otherwise we'll be scattered throughout the whole earth." Throughout the earth. That's, of course, God's plan for them to be scattered. Then the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the humans were building. Verse 6, and this is kind of the key what I wanted to focus on. The Lord said, "If they have begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them." They're going to succeed in this. They're going to build this city, and it's going to work. It's going to keep the earth from being populated, at least the way that God wanted it to be. So we read in verse 7, "Come, let's go down there and confuse their language so they will not understand one another's speech." So from there the Lord scattered them throughout the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it is called Babylon. That's the CSB has the word Babylon here. Yours likely has the word Babel. For there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them throughout the earth. Whether Babel and Babylon are exactly the same or not is impossible to determine thousands and thousands of years after the fact. Certainly they are in the same general area, and the connection between Babel or Babylon, or we're going to talk about Ur, the Chaldees here in a little bit, all these population centers in Mesopotamia, this general region, these are efforts by Nimrod and presumably others as well to try to subvert God's plan and build cities. Now, I'm not here to say if you're living in a city, then you're going to hell. That's not the point here. But at this particular time in history, certainly, cities are emphasizing man's will for mankind instead of God's will for mankind. And we understand how that works in the sinful, godless world out there. Getting people together, uniting them around a task, uniting them geographically and politically, etc. There is a very real way that we can see bigger being better. The bigger a city we can build, the bigger a society we can build, the more things we can do, the more efficient our machine's going to run, et cetera, et cetera. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But it is worth noting here that if you are one of these titans of industry, if you're one of these people who is moving and shaking and getting things done, et cetera, there's probably going to come some kind of situation where God's will is going to be contrary to yours, that God's plan for humanity, God's plan for your own personal life, God's plan for the people under your charge is going to be different from your own plan. You're not going to be able to accomplish your things in a way that honors God. In those times, people of faith presumably are going to be able to back up and say, you know what, God's things are the most important things for us. If you are godless, if you are diminishing the importance of God in your life and the people who are in your charge, you're going to hold your own way. You're going to do the Nimrod kind of thing here. We need to be able to distinguish between our purposes and God's purposes. And when we see them at odds with one another, we need to be able to step back and to acknowledge the primacy of God's plan and to sublimate our own desires, our own wishes, our own desires. Now, you may really, really, really want to build a city or a business or whatever it happens to be that you're interested in. If you find out that you cannot fear God and keep his commandments and do that to the degree that you want to do it, then you need to back away from that, because we realize that the whole of man, the whole of duty of man, what applies to every person, depending on your translation there in Ecclesiastes 12:13, it should be all about serving God. It should be all about our connection to God and the things of God and the plan of God for my life. Those are the things that Jesus is going to empower me to accomplish. Back to Philippians 4:13. I will be able to do those things because God is going to do them for me in my life. I walk in the light as he is in the light, and Jesus is going to give me that power. And that is an incredibly liberating kind of thing. It's not up to me to make a success out of my life. My life is automatically a success because I am trusting God to guide my life. Now, that's not necessarily a formula that is conducive to personal success. In fact, it very well may hinder your personal success. We need to have enough humility, have enough faith to know that God's way is better for us, even when, and especially when, it doesn't seem to be working for our short-term carnal purposes. It's not intended to work those things. Yes, in a general sense, Jesus wants us to seek first the kingdom, and these other things are going to be added to us, borrowing from Genesis 6, verse 33. But that's not to suggest that all of these things, these physical things, food and shelter and all the rest of it, that this is God's plan for your life. It's not. The kingdom is his plan for your life. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Everyone turned to his own way. The text says there prophetically in Isaiah 53 and verse 6. And he's talking there prophetically about Jesus' generation, but really he's talking about humanity in general. That we as a race, all of us, every human being, we have decided what path is best for us. And that got us into trouble. That caused Jesus to be sent to the earth to die for our sins, because going in our own way is the ultimate in sinful behavior. That is choosing not to follow after God, choosing not to serve God. We have to be better than that. We have to have more faith, more purpose, more commitment to God and to God's things than that. We hold to God's line, and we do not get sidetracked by these dreams of others for us or the dreams that we have for ourselves. If God's will is not compatible with such things, then such things are going to have to go. Now, I want to talk about this idea of speech here a little bit also, because I find this interesting. God could have used any number of ways to scatter the people, including grabbing them by the scruff of the neck and throwing them onto another continent. He could have done that too. But he allows the communication process to break down here. And I find this to be interesting here. Nimrod's success, Babel's success, was dependent on everybody working together, speaking the same language as one another, having the same vocabulary. I think the CSB has there in verse number 1, the same language and vocabulary. That's a very handy kind of thing. When we talk like our neighbors talk, when we have that same lingo, the same language, the same speech patterns, etc., clearly it's much, much easier to get the job done. I'm sure that you have been in situations where you're trying to communicate, you're trying to work together with someone who's not necessarily a native speaker of the language that you speak, and there's a conflict there. And you're not necessarily seeing eye to eye, and it's a lot of work to get through all of that. Wouldn't it be easier if we all talked exactly the same? Well, it would be. We would get our things done much, much easier if we did that. Well, how does that apply to spiritual things? Well, oftentimes we will find that the best way for us to get along with people in general is to talk like they talk and think like they think and do like they do. And it works. The more worldly we get around our worldly neighbors, the more peace we have, the more harmony we have, the more function we have. It seems to go much, much better. And then we see these puritanical, or pharisaical, use whatever pejorative term you want here, these Christians who don't do that, who want to sound different, who want to push back against the things of God and speak their own language, speak God's language, as it were. They don't function as well with the world. And we think of that as being a bad thing. Well, it's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it very well may be not only a good thing, but a needful thing for Christians, because he wants us to be separate. He doesn't want us to cooperate effectively with the people of the world. He wants us to speak his things rather than our neighbor's things. And this is a real struggle because obviously we're human beings as well as being Christians. We are in a sinful world surrounded by sinful people. To a certain degree, we need to be able to be functional with them, and that requires a certain amount of communication. And meeting them at their level, because clearly they're not going to meet us at our level. They're not going to come up to meet us in God's things. So we're going to have to go down there and meet with them in the world's things. And then they see us as brethren, and they shake our hand, they pat our back, and everything's all hunky-dory and such. As far as carnal pursuits go, yes. But you're not going to get God's pursuits that way. You're not going to serve God's purposes that way. That kind of unity does a very good job of opening up the umbrella and incorporating as many people as possible. Just ignore all the differences, and you're going to find out you get along really well. That's just common sense. Anybody could see that. There must be a reason why God tells us to do exactly the opposite of that. That God tells us to come out from among them and be separate. He asks us to distinguish ourselves from our neighbors, particularly with regard to spiritual things. In Genesis chapter 24 and verse 3, Abraham is determined to send his servant, not Isaac himself, to send his servant out of the country to his distant kinsmen, who presumably still know God, know the things of God, at least better than the Canaanites did anyway. He wants to find a wife for his son Isaac. He's not going to find a decent wife in his area. The same thing is true, or the opposite of that is true, rather. A couple generations later, in chapter 26, verses 34 and 35, Esau wants to be the head of the family. He wants to inherit his father Isaac's fortune, and so he builds a family for himself, and he goes to the Hittites there in the area. He marries two of them, just kind of doubling down on his rebellion, as it were. And the text says there that his wives caused a great deal of consternation for his parents. His parents wanted better things for Esau than that. And if you know anything about the Esau story, you'll know that this is pretty much in character for what Esau is. Esau's not concerned about spiritual things. He wants to have a wife for himself, or as is the case, two wives for himself. He wants to have a family. He wants to have all of these kind of things. But incorporating his plan into God's plan isn't really a thing for Esau. He'll incorporate God's plan into his own plan if that helps, if that eases the burden and such, but that's not really a concern for him. He is a carnal man, a vulgar man, someone who doesn't care anything about spiritual things. We're told that in the book of Genesis. We're told again in Hebrews when the Hebrew writer retells this story of Esau. We need to rise above that. We need to be able to see beyond our immediate surroundings and escape what might seem to be a simple solution that is accomplished by working with the things of the world, and instead find unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 3. The unity of the Spirit, spoiler alert, is going to be smaller and harder fought than unity in the world. If all you need to do to be unified is ignore everything that we fight over, you can be unified with anybody in that situation. That's not what God's plan is. God's plan is for you to be separate from your sinful society. And there's every indication that the society here at Babel is a sinful society. The sinful people are running it. Again, they're trying to subvert God's plan for the world in this effort. So clearly they're not pursuing the things of God. God's people should be stronger than that, should be more spiritual than that. And so therefore we're willing, and in fact we are insistent upon separating ourselves from those ones who do not speak like us, who do not think like us, who do not act like us, at least in spiritual matters. Now, we're not going to leave the world entirely. Paul talks about this a little bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where he told them not to associate with the world, but not to withdraw from people in the world, because you have to go out of the world to do that. He says that we ourselves, as the people of God, need to look like the people of God. He goes on to talk about this more in chapter 6, that we flee fornication, and that our body is a temple of the Spirit, that the way we use our body, the way we interact with people in this life reflects on God's plans for our life. And if we truly value His plans more than our own plans, then we're going to be able to speak His way, act His way, do His things rather than our own things. And if that means we don't get to live in the big city like we wanted to, we're prepared to deal with that because we are prioritizing His things always. Now, before we close up, I wanted to point out one interesting aspect to Genesis chapter 11. Generally speaking, in my experience anyway, when I talk about Genesis chapter 11, I stop in verse number 9. Because after that we get the family records of Shem and, oh great, genealogies. That's my favorite part of Genesis is the genealogies, right? Just names and numbers and blah, 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 blah. At the end of this story, though, at the end of the genealogies, there's a very interesting narrative given to us in verse number 31. Terah, who's at the end of the family of Shem, Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, Haran's son, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they set out together from Ur the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years and died in Haran, and then Abraham takes on the family responsibility, or Abram, he's known at the time in chapter 12, and they wind up going to Canaan like the plan was originally. Now, what Terah's part was in this plan, the text doesn't really talk about very much. Clearly, Abram is the star of the show here, or God is the star of the show, and Abram is his chosen vessel, his chosen representative here. And Ur of the Chaldees, of course, is right there in the middle of Mesopotamia. It's the major city, evidently, in this particular time here. This is that area. And as these people are scattering, as everybody is leaving and dispersing in this land, one of the families that leaves is Terah. Now, a little bit of background here. If you run the numbers, I went and bounced the numbers around a little bit, and it is chapter 10 talks about how in the days of Peleg, the land was divided. Now, what exactly does that mean? The easy explanation, and I'm not suggesting it's the wrong explanation, the easy explanation is that God gave a great sign in the days of Peleg, probably right around his birth. And that's why his name commemorates this event. This event happened that facilitated the spread of human beings everywhere. Well, that sounds like the Babel story. At least it's connected to the Babel story. If you take the impression, or take the idea that Babel takes place in the year that Peleg was born, or close to it anyway, here we have Terah later on down the line having this son Abraham right a few years anyway before Peleg dies. So they're contemporaneous to a certain degree at least. This dispersion doesn't necessarily happen overnight, but it is happening on an ongoing basis. And it could be that Terah, for whatever reason, has pushed back against emigrating to other areas, but finally God catches up with him, or for some reason or another, he's ready to go now. This is part of this dispersion. Where is he going to go? Well, he's going to go to a land called Canaan. Why Canaan? Well, because that's where God wants that family. And especially he wants Abram there. Not in Ur. Well, what's wrong with Ur? Well, mainly it wasn't God's plan. I'm not sure we can get more specific than that. We can draw some inferences like we did before about city life versus country life, etc. But what it basically boils down to is that God had a plan that Abram's family be in this place over here, and as it happened, he was in this place over here instead. And so God asks him to seek this new land. Well, what's it going to look like? I don't know. No indication that he told him anything. You're just going to go where I tell you to go, and you're going to stay where I tell you to stay, and eventually that land is going to be yours, and you're going to be this great nation. You have to trust me on this. And it's really kind of the opposite of the Babel story, isn't it? In Babel, you're trusting in human beings. This plan looks very interesting. We have the wherewithal to accomplish this great plan here. It sounds really great. The people running it seem like they really know what they're doing. We're going to dig in here and do this plan. Well, no, you're not, actually. God's going to interfere with that. But regardless of how successful or unsuccessful you are in this plan, ultimately it's setting an agenda for yourself and for your family that's contrary to God's purposes. God says, leave that land, leave that philosophy, leave that way of thinking, and do this other thing instead. Go to where I am telling you to go. Now, spoiler alert, if you're kind of on the fence with regard to this so far, realize that when you make this decision, when you decide you're going to go where God is taking you rather than where all your neighbors are, where your friends are, where maybe your family is, you make that decision, you're going to make some enemies. People are going to be confused. They're going to be annoyed. They may even get to the point where they try to stop you from doing this. Our plan if we are servants of God, if we are truly pursuing God's things, is to simply go where he tells us to go and believe that he's going to work it out for us. You may understand the plan. You may not understand the plan in any given step of the process. But a person of faith is going to be able to push through all of these things like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did, wandering in the land of Canaan, never receiving anything from themselves, but investing in the future for their family. That's what we are doing. We're not being called to go to a specific place for a specific purpose, at least not as far as God is telling us. But we are called to go to heaven, a heavenly city, the same city that they were pursuing, in some fashion anyway, according to Hebrews chapter 11. In Isaiah chapter 52, there's a passage that's referenced in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 with regard to our moral behavior, our relationship or lack of relationship with the people of the world. In Isaiah's day, he's looking forward to Babylonian captivity, or maybe not looking forward to Babylonian captivity exactly, but you know what I mean. The people are going to go into Babylon. They're going to stay there for 70 years. Isaiah doesn't have all the information with regard to that, but it's going to happen. And then it's going to be over, and then they're going to come back. And God is going to, again, begin this process of putting the people where he wants them to be. In Isaiah 52, referring to Babylon, in verse number 11, Jews in Babylon, that is, he says, leave, go out from there, do not touch anything unclean, go out from her, purify yourselves, you who carry the vessels of the Lord, for you will not leave in a hurry, and you will not have to take flight, because the Lord is going before you, and the God of Israel is your rear guard. This mission to go to where we belong, to establish God's things in our lives, and hopefully in the lives of our children and grandchildren. This is this grand mission. And he says it's not necessarily a hurry that we're looking at here. It's not going to happen tomorrow. This is a plan that you have in place, and you're going to pursue the things of God. It starts today. It goes for the rest of your life. Every aspect of your life, and Isaiah is talking 100 plus years before this return, before the exile ever happened at all. He's saying, You put yourself in a position to allow God to accomplish these things for you. You leave these other things behind. God is taking you to this place, and you embrace that. You want that because you know that God's plan for yourself is better than any kind of plan that you might have for yourself. Paul refers to, or Luke recording Paul's, well, actually it's Jesus' words, not Paul's words, in this confrontation that Jesus has with then Saul of Tarsus in chapter 9, chapter 22, chapter 26. It's told 3 times to us here. In at least one of these occasions, depending on your translation, one of these tellings of the story, Jesus tells Saul there, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. I love that expression there. The idea of God nudging you in a certain direction over and over and over again. I have my theories as to what Jesus means by that, but what it means for us is simply this. God is giving us one opportunity after another to go in his direction. And sometimes when we resist that, when we push back against that, he gives us the goad. He pokes us a little bit. He's trying to get us to do a better thing. And we choose to rebel against God for being so rude and so ornery and poking us when we don't want to be poked. And so we're going to kick against this goad. We're going to just double down on our rebellion. Jesus says don't do that. Jesus says submit to God's plan for your life. You can and you will succeed in his things if you will allow him to take you where he wants you to go. That very likely is going to mean leaving something that you don't want to leave. Nevertheless, that is going to be necessary in some situations for God to accomplish what he is trying to accomplish. So submit to his will, allow him to take you where he is wanting you to go, and rejoice that you're given the opportunity. And whatever hardship, whatever difficulty, whatever poke in the rear end you get along the way, thank God for that, because ultimately, no matter what we may suffer, no matter what inconvenience or discomfort or whatever we have to suffer, it's better for us in the long run, and it's really better for us in the short run, for us to go where God is trying to take us. And may God empower you on that journey, help you draw closer to heaven, closer to your spiritual objectives, even here on earth while we wait for these things. And thank God for the opportunity. God bless.